Welcome and thank you for being here with me in this journey. So, as you know, in this class, you are going to learn about one of the oldest essays that we have studied, which is T.S. Eliot's Tradition and Individual Talent, which we certainly must have studied first in BA English and many times till now. So, my duty is just remind you about this essay. So, the first part I have dedicated purely for T.S. Eliot. Some of the most important thing about him because he is such a great figure in literary criticism as a poet, as a playwright. So we need a better introduction from the examination point of view. 9 things I would like to say about T.S. Eliot. Initially, as an introduction, the first part is that literary modernism is unimaginable without Eliot. That's a quotation. So, about whom this is said, you must understand that it is said about T.S. Eliot. And second point, everybody knows he is central to Anglo-American poets, that is, both England and America. He has contributed to both literary criticism. And the third point, again, you know that he stands among with a poet critic tradition. Actually, it started with Philip Sidney, then went on to Samuel Johnson, Coleridge, then Matthew Arnold, and T.S. Eliot. So, and Dylan Thomas, famously called T.S. Eliot as the Pope in literature. So, which person is known as the Pope? Remember, it is Dylan Thomas said about T.S. Eliot. And another expression commonly heard is that the literary dictator. It is said about T.S. Eliot, and it is called by a critic which we have fortunately not studied, Delmore Schwartz. Delmore Schwartz. And as you know, he won Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948. Nobody is going to ask, but still we know. And another important question, who is associated with lemon squeezing method of criticism? In 1948, T.S. Eliot criticized new criticism for taking his method and adopting it in a wrong manner. And he called that way of criticism as lemon squeezing method. It is a criticism on new criticism by T.S. Eliot. And he brought back the most important thing, which is known as tradition. And two works were followed just because of him. Sometimes they may ask. The first one is Revaluation, Tradition and Development in English Poetry, written by F.R. Lewis in 1936. Modern Poetry and Tradition, written by Cleon Brooks in 1939. So T.S. Eliot has, this is the thing we must know about an introduction. And some of his works, we have to say, as you know, he's a propounder of impersonality theory of poetry. Sacred Wood, his first critical work, appeared in 1920. As you know, Traditional Individual Talent, published in 1919, later came in this work, The Sacred Wood. And obviously, Wasteland in 1922, Criterion, just note it down because we have to study that also. And Traditional Individual Talent was published in two parts in 1919, one in September, other in December. And he also helped a lot of new literary talents like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf. It was he who published James Joyce's first work, Virginia Woolf work. So he has helped a lot of people. And from 1930 onwards, he turned to verse drama. We know Murder in the Cathedral, 1935, Cocktail Party in 1950. Just actually, those things I have to mention and know. And what is this present legacy of T.S. Eliot? From 1970 onwards, he started to face a lot of criticism. Basically, he is criticized for being what you may call close to fascism, racism, anti Semitism. And more importantly, he totally denounced romantic poetry. That is the greatest criticism against him because he never thought romantic poetry as something great. And today he's judged as his judgment as highly narrow and elitist. So that is his present legacy. So these are the things we must know about T.S. Eliot as a writer. In the second part, we go and do tradition and individual talent. Yes, in this part, we are going to discuss about essay in detail. As you know, it has divided into three parts. So we will go one by one. The first part, he speaks about tradition and depersonalization. In the second part, he expounds his theory of impersonal theory, and third part, he sums up. The first point, as you know, you remember, he said is that tradition is a word which has got a lot of negative connotations in British culture. It is referred to the science of archaeology. And the second thing is the most important comment about him. That is one of the central argument runs through when we appreciate a poet or when we criticize a poet, we have to focus on his work, not on his personality. So that is the second thing he says. And more importantly, he says when we appreciate a poet, we look for what is individual in him compared to the poets gone before him. So, in other words, what Eliot is trying to say that a poet cannot stand alone. He is always compared with the people who went before him. And he says that when you call something as individual in any poetry, even you can find the dead poet asserting their immortality in the most individual part. And he says that in order to be a poet, one must have a historical sense. And he says historical sense cannot be inherited, it has to be obtained by hard labor. In other words, Matthew Arnold say the same thing about tradition, that is, you must study the great poets if you want to be an author. So that is the same thing Eliot says, that you must have the classical knowledge of literature. And then he says that he also means, he adds something more to Matthew Arnold, is that it must have timelessness as well as temporal. That is, timelessness means it must be always at the same, and second thing, it must be in the present. That point was missing in Matthew Arnold when he spoke of tradition. He only looked at the past, but Eliot says you must know the past, but you must also stand in the present, and it must be a communion between past and present. And he says that you must also aware of the mind of the Europe and the mind of your own country. That is what he means, the temporal. Okay, and says that you must also have a private mind. And he says that a poet get appreciation always in relation to another poet. Actually, this is what we have seen in cricket and all. I am sure you must have seen watching growing up Sachin Tendulkar play. And cover drive, everybody does it. But when Sachin does it, it is compared with great players like Brad Bradman and Vivian Richards. So actually, cover drive is there for many years. But if you want to be a great player, you must know about your old players, their style. Same thing he speaks about poetry. And see, he says that poetry, that is where he is strongly critique of romantic poetry. It is not turning loose of emotions, he says in the second part, but a total surrender to something valuable. Poetry or poem writing was a serious business for T.S. Eliot. He thought it has a much purpose to do. Remember, he saw the horrors of the First World War. And it is said that 8.5 million soldiers got died and 13.5 million civilians died according to official records. So you can imagine the kind of death he has seen in his life. And that is why he says that poetry is not a place for a poet to express his personal emotion. He must surrender to something valuable. And he says that an artist, it's a continual self-sacrifice and an extension of personality. He must try to avoid his personality and he must sacrifice to perfect his craft. And he says that in depersonalization, avoiding personal emotions. Why? He says in the second part of the essay. So now we move on to the second part of the essay where he speaks more about impersonal theory. And I know here he says about honest criticism or appreciation. Always don't attack the poet, attack his work. And common thing, a poet mind is like a catalyst. And he says that of sulfuric acid, they may ask you, uh, he says that poet's mind operates on experience and feelings. And he says that poet's mind is a storing house for feelings, phrases, and images, and it must work as a catalyst. What are those things? It is oxygen and sulfur oxide, which create sulfuric acid in the presence of platinum. And he says that great poetry can be written without emotions. And he quotes from Dante, note down Inferno, Canto 15. He says that the poet, that part is written without any emotion and it is still beautiful. Then he says that in a poem, when you speak of emotions, and the emotion should be of artistic emotion, not poet's emotion. And he gives two examples. One is from Dante again, and second is from Othello. So just imagine if Shakespeare expresses his emotion to Othello, that is a failure. Whereas Othello expresses his emotion as a character, artistic emotion. That's the word Eliot uses. And he criticizes Nightingale because Nightingale has nothing to do with the real Nightingale. Only Keats expresses his own personal feelings. And he says that poetry is not a place for a poet to express his personality. Again, I think of the time in which he was living, and a lot of people were undergoing a lot of complex emotions, pain, and all. So, if a poet comes up and says his own personal emotion, it looks rude. So that is why he speaks about. So you must understand the historical context behind it. And he speaks about another example, the Revenger's Tragedy by Cyril Turner. He says that he presents both positive and negative emotions, and that create a new emotions. And his famous attack on Wordsworth, he says that people have complex and unusual emotions in life, and one of the error of poet is to find new emotions. He says that the business of the poet is to find ordinary emotions and work on it. And emotions, poetry is not emotions recollected in tranquility, because just imagine Wordsworth, he had a good life. At the same time, when Eliot was writing this, he was undergoing one of the most traumatic period of his life. His wife was mentally unstable, and 1920s and 1930s, one of the worst times of his life. So he cannot recollect his feelings and write into great poetry. We must understand that. And his theory of poetry is, he clearly says poetry is not a place for turning loose of emotions. You must have control yourself. You must think of the reader and for what value you can give to him. And you must, for that, you have to kill your personality. Once a poet thinks that he is great, it's failure. And you come to the third part, and it starts with a quotation. Sometimes when I ask, it is taken from Aristotle's De Anima, the work, and he says that the mind is doubtlessly something more divine and unaffected, the mind of a poet. And he concludes the aim is, again, attention give to the poetry and appreciate the technical excellence of the poem. And that two phrases were taken by new criticism, and they started to appreciate the technical excellence of the poem, and they also were against biographical criticism. And actually, it is this essay which became a kind of a cornerstone for new criticism to flourish. And that is why back in 1948, Eliot has to call these people, as you are using lemon squeezing method, this is not what I meant. So thank you very much. I think this was a lengthy video. I'm sorry. This I have to teach you like this because I think this is an important and seminal essay, and questions can be asked, and I don't want you to miss that. So once again, I appreciate you and I honor you. I value your journey, and I'll see you in the next class. Until then, take care. Bye bye.